Hello and welcome to another Top 10 Pauper Commander review with me, Darcy Bits. This time for Outlaws of Thunder Junction. This is a very cool set, but honestly, I'm a little disappointed in the selection for Pauper Commanders. Don't get me wrong, there are a lot of really strong Pauper Commanders from the set. They're just not all that interesting. Furthermore, most of the best ones are legendary, which is always just a little less interesting, because they could be your commander in Commander. Only Pauper Commander can you use just a normal uncommon creature. But to get things started, we have number 10 with a very interesting, gimmicky build around. Deepmuck Desperado is a 3-mana, 2/4 blue Homerid Mercenary. It reads, whenever you commit a crime, each opponent mills 3 cards. This ability triggers only once each turn. This is number 10. It's probably not going to actually be very good, but it does have potential. Even though it has that limiter of once per turn, in a 4-player commander game, you could be milling the entire table for 12 cards every turn cycle. All you have to do is commit a crime, which, if you haven't been keeping up with Outlaws of Thunder Junction, is anything that targets an opponent, anything they control, or anything in their graveyard. There are plenty of free crimes we can commit in blue reliably every turn, whether that's once per turn cycle with a tap ability, or for very little mana. On top of that, most mill effects are crimes themselves, so we can double down on this theme. Even if we have no other mill effects in the deck, if Deepmuck Desperado comes down on turn 3, sticks on the board, and we are able to commit 4 crimes per turn cycle, we can reliably mill out our opponents by turn 9. Throw in a few extra mill pieces, and that number comes down dramatically. Next is Baron Bertram Greywater, a 4-mana white and black 3/4 vampire noble. They are legendary, so if you want to take this into full-on commander, you fully can. Whenever one or more tokens enter the battlefield under your control, create a 1/1 black vampire rogue creature token with lifelink. This ability triggers only once each turn, so yeah, it doesn't go infinite with itself. For 2 mana, you can sacrifice another creature or artifact to draw a card. Really solid stats, and you're getting extra token the first time you'd make a token each turn. Once again, this can trigger on your opponent's turn if you have some sort of instant speed token generation, but generally speaking, this is just value, and that's kind of the thing with this whole set is the cards are just kind of good. There's nothing specifically a build around here. Yeah, you gotta have token generators, so we know our theme is token generation, and card draw is always good in the command zone. It's just a good card. It's number 9 mostly because I think 4 mana is a bit expensive. If this could come down on turn 3 and be a smaller stat body like a 2/2, I think this card would be a lot stronger. Number 8, Cactusfolk Shot. 4 mana, red and green, 4/4 plant mercenary. It has reach and ward 2. At the beginning of combat on your turn, other creatures you control with power 4 or greater gain trample and haste until end of turn. I think this card actually has a lot of potential. It's sticky, it can block well, and it has a very clear game plan. Just 4 or bigger creatures in your deck. On turn 5, you can play a 5-drop, and it has haste. It's just going to support that game plan very easily, very cleanly. Now it is 4 mana, once again. Is that too slow? For this deck, probably not, just because you want these big bodies anyway. You're planning on doing some big stuff on turns 4, 5, 6. So maybe it will fit the curve better than Bertram does. But regardless, I think this one's really strong. It's just, once again, not super interesting. Number 7, Honest Rutstein. 3 mana, black and green, 3/2 human warlock. Once again, legendary human warlock. When Honest Rutstein enters the battlefield, return target creature card from your graveyard to your hand. Creature spells you cast cost 1 less to cast. I feel like it's pretty straightforward what I'm going to say here. It's just discounting every creature spell by 1. That's fantastic. Run a bunch of creatures. Yes, it has this little minor interaction with the graveyard, but it's so minor. Like, I don't think this is the commander for your self-mill green-black deck. In fact, this card wants you to cast creatures, not resurrect them from the graveyard. It's such a weird addition because it feels like it's not actually a build-around, and then the other half of the card just isn't a build-around at all. It's just run creatures. So, it's gonna be strong, but it's not interesting. Number 6, Kraum Violent Cacophony, a 4 mana blue and red 2/3 zombie horror, once again legendary. has flying, and whenever you cast your second spell each turn, put a +1/+1 counter on Kraum, Violent Cacophony, and draw a card. The fact that this is not just growing once per turn, but it is growing once per turn and drawing you a card and has flying makes this a really scary piece. I think there are stronger cards that have flying and grow, but that card draw is going to make sure you don't run out of steam. I also think this card's a lot more interesting of a build around, even though the payoff is just I get big and I draw you cards, which is the most boring build around, even though it is probably the most effective build around. The build around is interesting. It wants you to cast 2 spells each turn. It's not Storm, Spellslinger, cast a million spells in one turn. It's just hit this threshold, then wait till the next turn, then hit 2, then hit 2, right? All these once per turn are actually really interesting effects because they make you sort of pace out your actions across all of your opponent's turns instead of doing everything on yours or everything on your opponent's end step. I think it's really, really fun, and I think this is going to be a really fun commander for the decks that want them. It's just, you could probably take an existing deck and then just change the commander to Kraum and it would work well. It's not all that interesting or unique. Number 5, Doc Aurlock Grizzled Genius. 2 mana, green and blue, 2/3, legendary creature, Bear Druid. Spells you cast from your graveyard or from exile cost 2 less to cast. Plotting cards from your hand costs 2 less. So this is the first time we've talked about plotting. Plotting is an alternate means of casting a spell that sort of banks it for the future and then you can reap the rewards then. A decent number of uncommons have plot, but it specifically needs to be done from hand. You can't plot from the command zone, so we couldn't run those cards. There's a few options in common, but that's not why we're going to run Doc Aurlock. Just like Honest Rutstein, this just discounts your cards, and it's going to be value and good, but it's not super interesting. Unlike Honest Rutstein, Doc Aurlock has a very specific thing that it's discounting. And that does give them an interesting build-around potential and encourage you to run cards you might otherwise not. While we're not going to be engaging with plot very much, we do have a lot of potential to interact with Flashback or Disturb or, well, that's about it actually. Basically Flashback or Disturb. And that's probably fine. That seems like a good build-around and it's a good benefit. 2 mana is a lot. That could really dramatically change an effect. We could probably also run some self-mill effects to get stuff into our graveyard quickly. I think it seems like an interesting deck, even if the benefit of the build-around is just mana efficiency. It's not doing anything fancy. Number 4, Lazav, Familiar Stranger. 3 mana, blue and black, 1/4, legendary creature, Shapeshifter. Whenever you commit a crime, put a +1/+1 counter on Lazav, Familiar Stranger. Then you may exile a card from a graveyard. If a creature card was exiled this way, you may have Lazav become a copy of that card until end of turn. This ability triggers only once each turn. I absolutely love this card. I think it's really cool. We've seen Lazav in the past be able to turn into other creatures to varying effect. It's really reliant on the creature they turn into. So fill your deck with big things, get them in your own graveyard, have Lazav turn into them. Very cool, but here, every time we're committing a crime, once per turn, we are able to actually grow Lazav. So even if the creature they're turning into is not that big a deal, at least they're getting bigger every time. This card is very reliant on what you put into the deck, and also could benefit from milling your opponents because it's a graveyard, not just graveyard. So I think this one has the most interesting build around and interesting payoff and gives you space to be unique as a deck builder and use them in different ways compared to the other cards we've seen today. Number 3, Miriam, Herd Whisperer, a 2 mana green and white 3/2 legendary human druid. As long as it's your turn, mounts and vehicles you control have hexproof. Whenever a mount or vehicle you control attacks, put a +1/+1 counter on it. So a mount is a new type in this set. They are creatures that you can effectively crew to not make them become creatures, but give them extra benefits. We are not going to be interacting with that almost at all. In green-white, there are only, I think, 2 common mounts, but the history of green and white, or colorless, vehicles is strong enough that I think this is actually going to be a very interesting card. She really does everything you want, especially with vehicles. I think despite the fact that she's kind of built for mounts because of the theme of the set, the fact that she can also interact with vehicles gives her way more potential, because vehicles stop being a creature at the end of your turn. If they have hexproof on your turn, and they're artifacts on your opponent's turn, they're going to be really hard for your opponents to deal with. In addition, she's just growing a vehicle every turn. So just actually a really cool build around, actually a really cool benefit. I think this paves the way for a really interesting new deck archetype in green-white to play around with. And there's probably a lot of different ways you could build this deck. Number 2, Ertha Joe, Frontier Mentor. A 4-mana red and white 2/4 Core Advisor, legendary Core Advisor. When Ertha Joe, Frontier Mentor, enters the battlefield, create a 1/1 red mercenary creature token with tap. Target creature you control gets +1/+0 until end of turn. Activate only as a sorcery. Whenever you activate an ability that targets a creature or player, copy that ability. You may choose new targets for the copy. So that's what we're really running over, that second part. It's a lot of text to say I make a token, but that second move, ooh, now we've got an interesting build around. There are so many different things you could do with this. The actual card itself, it makes a token that has an activated ability that targets, but we can just run our deck full of activated abilities that target things. There are absolutely so many ways that you could build this deck, and that's what makes her really, really interesting. Once again, we're seeing 4 mana, so she might be coming down a bit too late, but if you have your deck full of tap abilities that can be copied, that are free other than the tap cost, as long as you are seeding your board with these permanents, when Ertha Joe comes down on 4, she could benefit you immediately. And number 1, Forsaken Miner. This is a 1-mana 2/2 black non-legendary skeleton rogue. Forsaken Miner can't block. Whenever you commit a crime, you may pay 1 black. Just a single black, not 1 and a black. If you do, return Forsaken Miner from your graveyard to the battlefield. Okay, maybe this was a bit of a me making this number 1, but I still actually stand by it. This is such an interesting card. It is something we've seen a lot of before, but this is a really, really efficient version of the effect. And being a 2/2 body is very interesting. Being 1 mana initially, being only 1 mana to actually resurrect them, assuming you have some form of crime. There's so much we can do by cycling this. If we have something on board, for example, that sacrifices a creature as a cost, Forsaken Miner's in the graveyard by the time that effect resolves. If that effect was a crime, we can spend 1, bring them right back again immediately. I just think that this opens up a lot of weird strategies, and I'm excited to see what people might do with Forsaken Miner. Does that mean they're actually the best? I don't know, but I love it when you have a really interesting tool in the command zone. And also, I just couldn't help but make a non-legendary, our number 1 card. Overall, I'm really excited about Outlaws of Thunder Junction. I think it's a really cool, really interesting, really playable set. Ertha Joe especially seems really, really cool. And if you're going for thematic, Doc Aurlock is a bear druid. That's awesome. So there's a lot to love about this set, and I can't wait to play with it. I've been Darcy Bits. This has been my top 10 Pauper Commander review of Outlaws of Thunder Junction.